Hello everyone, Memory here. Since I've got a bit more currencies to spend compared to my previous leagues, I decided to try and copy a build because most of the time I attempt to copy a build in the past, I always ended up spending a lot more than intended. Either because the gear becomes more expensive or I had to make adjustments because certain parts of the build is not functioning to my likings. And usually that will set me back a week or two worth of overall progression, which is something that I would like to avoid. This time, with lots of currencies in hand, I can afford to do so if it happens again. So this video will be focusing more on the process of me researching for a build, picking a build, tweaking the build to suit my playstyle, why it went wrong, and how I ended up having to make the build from scratch. I still ended up with a fairly decent build that feels kinda like playing Pac-Man, so I thought maybe some of you would like to see the thought process behind a casual build maker attempt to yeet a build from POE Ninja. And hopefully this would help some of you to have a better time on copying or making builds. Anyways, the first step is to research for a build type that I wanted to play. The main focus here is budget, because no matter how good a build looks, if it costs a mirror for it to be functional, it is out of reach for most people. Now, a good way to know if a build can be made with reasonable budget and have reasonable performance at the same time is by looking at how many people are playing it on POE Ninja. The more people are playing it, the more chance for it to be a good build, usually. So I started by looking at the main skill 5+ link section and check out all the skill that has more than 0.5% play rate. Within these skills, I'm looking for ones that have a playstyle that looks fun for me, and then do some elimination out of those ones with some further research. After the research, I landed on Blade Vortex because since I've just played a super zoom build, the build that are significantly slower just doesn't seem attractive for me, at least for this league anyways. I was choosing between Righteous Fire and Blade Vortex. I ended up picking Blade Vortex because I've already played a Righteous Fire build before, and since my Hero Bomber is leaning towards the Glass Cannon category, even though it is considered tanky amongst most of the other Hero Bombers, I would still like to have more beef to the build. So I decided to copy a Cold Blade Vortex build because freezing and slowing the enemies also helps with survivability. And after glancing through many of the builds, I see that the majority of the people are using occultists, so I added that into the filter. And then, because I usually like to use uniques for my weapon of choice, since weapons are often one of the most expensive part of the build if you are after a good rare weapon, so I ended up picking Void Battery as my weapon of choice. Void Battery is all about power charges, and Occultist has extra power charge in the Ascendancy passives, which is a fairly good synergy, so I added that into the filter as well. And then I just pick on the ones that has around 5 to 10 million DPS with around 4000 life, because this seems to be a sweet spot where most of the build would be doing decent damage, has decent defense, and not being too expensive at the same time. Obviously some builds are different, but this is just a good general starting point. As you copy more builds, you will start to have more ideas about what you should be looking for. For example, Ranger Bow builds will have less life than average, which builds might prefer 5 to 6000 energy shields instead as their average effective life pool, etc. I ended up picking this particular build because it ticked all the boxes. So now the next step is putting the build into path of building. We want to check if the build is inflating its damage by ticking lots of boxes that assumes the build is always in a perfect situation to do damage. And also if they pick Shaper Guardians or Cyrus as enemy, because bossing DPS is what most people use to compare damage. In this case, it only has a few ticks that seems to be reasonable for this build to constantly sustain, and it is against Shaper Guardian, which is good. I also like to check if they are using more than 120 passive points, because most of the builds are not gonna be leveled over 93, at least for me anyways. At level 93, you get 116 points. This build, for example, has 121 points, which is fine because taking away 5 passive points is not likely to break a build. We then move on to the items section to see if there are any super expensive gears that cannot be switched out. Immediately, I can see it is using lots of uniques, which usually means it is more likely to be cheap. We can take away the headhunter since the only way that can break the build is stat requirement. It looks like this build does need the strength and dex on the build, so that means we need to replace it with any build that gives similar amount of strength and dex, or getting the stats from the tree. In this case, it doesn't look too difficult to do so we worry about it later. Next, it uses 2 gamble rings, and through experience, I know that this is one of the few uniques that can be very expensive to get a decently raw one. But since it is not utilizing negative resistance, that means getting a rare ring that has similar stats can be a cheaper option. Looking down, we have Militant's Faith Timeless Jewel. People usually get Timeless Jewel to change keystones, and which keystone it changes into is determined by the name on the explicit. For example, the one that this build uses is under the name of Dominus, so we need to check if that particular name will make the Timeless Jewel expensive. In this case, it is not, so that's fine. Next, Watcher's Eye can be expensive sometimes, especially if it requires 2 or 3 specific lines. In this case, I can see that the physical to cold conversion is a must by looking at the damage portion, which is mostly cold converted from physical damage. The next line on it is spell suppression, and normally it would also be a core stat for a build. However, since the build does not have 100% spell suppression, that means spell suppression is either not the core defense mechanism of this build, or it simply doesn't care too much about defense. Either way, the spell suppression is not essential to have on this Watcher's Eye, and it turns out that a single line cold damage conversion Watcher's Eye is not expensive, so this is fine. And then we see an Unnatural Instinct Jewel. This thing is usually very expensive, and after the price check, it is expensive. But luckily, stat requirement is the only thing that would break the build if we take this jewel away, which is fairly easy to fix, so that's fine. Now, at this point, it seems to me that this build uses lots of jewels and expensive things to acquire base stats, which I don't like to see because that means it makes the build more complicated to level and build, since you have to constantly find alternative ways to get stats until you have all the gears in place. Also, there are a couple other things that I'm not happy about. For example, it doesn't have max lightning resist. It uses cluster jewels, which I usually like to avoid unless I absolutely have to. It has +1 power charge on the helmets and enemy explode on kill on the body armor, which are both very expensive stats that I also like to avoid. It doesn't have max spell suppression, which you should either have 0% or 100%, because the main purpose of spell suppression is to reduce one-shot hit damage. Not having 100% means there will still be a chance that you're gonna die to RNG, so you might as well spend those resources into other defense layers, or simply invest into more damage. Anyways, the point is, I had to make lots of changes here and there, and so I ended up rebuilding the entire thing, since I've already spent a couple of hours at that point learning about the build. Basically, I just took a few key items and passives like the Timeless Jewel and the Cold Conversion passives, and then just go nuts with adding things that I want, like the Iron Reflex and Spell Suppression combo. And this is what the final tree looks like, and this is what my items look like. Both of them has very little resemblance to the original build, but basically it has double the tankiness, half the cost, and fixed up all the little things that I just talked about, at the cost of cutting around 2/3 of the damage. I think this is worth because this build is supposed to be a mapper, and 2.5 million damage on this build is more than enough to farm G-Stop tier 16 map. If G-Stop tier 16 map is where I spend most of the time at, then this build is basically just a tankier version of my auto bomber. The original build straight from the POE Ninja would actually feel like a more expensive and less damaged version of my auto bomber. The reason I'm comparing this with my auto bomber is because if I don't have the auto bomber, I would actually go for the more glass cannon version because having more damage will increase the mapping speed. Even if it's a small increase, it will still make me grind the headhunter or whatever the goal was a few days earlier. But since I already have the auto bomber, I would want my other builds to serve a slightly different purpose. This build requires far less attention compared to my auto bomber, since anything that gets too close would either be frozen or become very slow. This means it has easier time dealing with certain things that my auto bomber would otherwise struggle with. For example, the cannot die aura or proximity shields. This build can just walk right in without much problem, whereas the auto bomber would have a slightly harder time dealing with them. This allows me to watch videos on the side while grinding, which makes the grind this much more enjoyable. In the end, I think I've spent around 20 exals worth of currency into the build, including some crafting and experiments expenses, plus the bottle of faith. Otherwise, this build can be done with less than 10 exals, maybe less depending on the market. It's still in the final stage of fine tuning, so I'll include the POB in the build guide video in the future, if I ended up making one. Anyways, that's it for today. Subscribe for extra mirror drop chins. Hopefully this helped some of you, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.